Korean National Diplomatic Academy. We have actually 70 minutes for this session, and we invited 5 panelists for our discussion this afternoon. Let me introduce to you the panelists from my right, Professor Shim Sang-min of Korea National Diplomatic Academy, and Professor Hong Song-pil of Yonsei University in Seoul, and Professor Banzai Hiroyuki of Waseda University, Japan. And next on my left is Professor Lu Jian of Fudan University, Shanghai, China. And Professor Wang Jiangyu of National Singapore University. So as you see, we have versatile composition of panelists to represent the diversity of views on international law in East Asia. Just before we start our discussion, let me briefly make a remark on the context in which the Center for International Law organized this session. As you are well aware, we are living in an era of hyper uncertainty caused by many factors, many political, social, and economic factors around the globe. Especially, we are witnessing the undermining of the foundation for liberal international order, which underpinned the world order since the end of the Second World War. And the economic polarization, together with social disintegration, is increasing, and the resistance against globalization is gaining traction nowadays. These phenomena are causing a lot of negative factors to the international order, such as extremism, nationalism, unilateralism, and populism. And these altogether are also putting strains on global governance. As you are well aware, we created the Group 20 meetings since the world economic crisis in 2008. But this forum is quite limited in handling political issues on the world stage, mainly focusing itself on economic aspect of international cooperation. On the other hand, the region we are living, namely in East Asia, we are struggling with the lack of confidence or trust among ourselves. And the power shift is underway due to the rise of China. So this is making our region very unpredictable and fluid. So, and one more thing I would like to point out is that the lack of regional integration in East Asia is quite conspicuous in comparison with other regions. Of course, Southeast Asia is far ahead of Northeast Asia in pushing ahead with regional cooperation and integration. I really envy the friends from Southeast Asian countries in this respect. Anyhow, in these regional and global settings, we are faced with very uncertain and unpredictable strategic environment in East Asia. Against this backdrop, we need to think about how to stabilize the strategic environment in this region. In that sense, the center is of the view that the role of international is quite important because international law itself is a collective set of norms that can address the issues of peace, prosperity, and human rights in our region. And it is also very important for us to seek a peaceful change amid the ongoing power shift in East Asia. So international law is a very useful and effective means to build trust and provide predictability that is sine qua non for economic prosperity we are now enjoying. So in this context, we prepared this session. So I'll give each panelist roughly 7 minutes for his presentation, and then we'll just proceed with discussion on what has transpired by the presentations. And then I'll open the floor to the audience. So let's start from Professor Wang Jiangyu from Singapore. Yeah.
I thought that was lost to you. Yeah, so, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I congratulate the Center for International Law of KDNA to organize this very important panel. This is the most critical time in Asia's history because we are facing a lot of uncertainties. You have a declining U.S., which has a foreign policy pattern which is very unpredictable, very much because the particular style of President Trump, and we have a rising China whose intention is not very clear, and we don't know what China wants, and we don't know what kind of country China will become. But China, there's almost no doubt that China will become a superpower. But what kind of superpower it will be? And we also have rising nationalism and protectionism and also terrorism. So the international society has enjoyed the protection of the liberal order for several decades. Now the liberal order, we used to take it for granted that you have the liberal international order, you have the WTO, and you have the UN, and you have the IMF, and you have the World Bank, so those international organizations, and you also have regional organizations in Asia, and every country is protected by this kind of system, which does not entirely embody international rule of law, but at least is marching toward the rule of law. That's what we thought. But now things seems to be changing. And that's why it's very important to organize such a panel to discuss those issues, especially in Asia. So I would consider our panel the most important one, although we don't have a lot of large audience here. I will address 3 issues. First, why international law is increasingly important, and but why its relevance seems to be declining. And the second, the Asians' attitude the general Asian attitude to international law. And the third, I will choose a very specific issue, the role of international law in Asia's security cooperation, security infrastructure building. Let me quickly start with the first one, why international law is important. As I as I mentioned, Asia has been the biggest beneficiary to the international order. After the Second World War, you have the very rapid economic takeoff of Japan, Korea, and the Southeast Asian countries, Singapore being one of them, and later China. Those countries developed. Those countries achieved economic development very much because of the benefits of the liberal international order, right? And one of the key pillars of the liberal international order is international law. So that's the international law. Why international law is important? Two reasons. The theoretical reason is rule of law itself is a universal value. So with the rule of law, you have transparency, you have predictability, and you have equality. Every country is equal before the law, as long as we know what the rules are, and so we can basically argue. Big countries and small countries can argue against each other based on the rules. Right? The practical reason is something I also mentioned. Right, the empirical evidence suggests that Asian countries benefited from this rule of law based order. The second point is the relevance of rule of law seems to be fading away, and power politics seems to become back in the recent years because of the U.S.-China strategic rivalry, and also because the rising economic and other nationalism in different countries. First in the U.S., in Europe, but now it seems to be coming to Asia, right? And on top of that, Asian countries largely, we have to admit this, Asian countries are largely ambivalent toward international law. There is a strong level of ambivalence toward international law. The empirical studies suggest that Asian countries, they participate less, and they are also underrepresented in international institutions. Right? Asian countries are not very willing to compare, even compared with Africa. So African countries are even more willing to submit their disputes to international dispute settlement mechanism, right? And you have a lot of African representatives in international institutions. And economically, Asia is much more developed than Africa. So it is indeed a puzzle why Asian countries are largely ambivalent, largely less enthusiastic in participating in the international system, although Asia has benefited from that. There are a few explanations. The first factor, history matters, and history matters. So Asian countries, if you look at the major Asian countries, right, the international law reminds China of the unequal treaties, right, of the invasion and the Western invasion, humiliation, and it reminds India of its colonial past. And it also reminds Japan of the selective use of international law in the post-war trial. So leading Asian countries largely believe that international law has been used instrumentally against them in the past. And the number two factor might be the legal culture. Right? Not every legal Asian country, actually most Asian countries, do not even have domestic rule of law. So if you do not even have domestic rule of law, if you do not recognize the legitimacy of rule of law in your home country, it's very unlikely for you to accept legitimacy of international law at the international level. And China being such an example, right? So another reason is more kind of realist. Even Western countries, even the U.S., supposed to be the vanguard, supposed to be the protector of the international system, they are not always good students. They are not always good citizens in international law. You have so many cases that the United States itself is a very serious violator of international law, right? And in Asia, right, the leading countries, the China being one of the example, is also not very inclined to comply with international law. Right? So international law can, when it comes to those powers' core interest, international law does not seem to be very useful in constraining those powers, right? So those might be the reasons why Asian countries are a bit ambivalent toward international law. Let me now jump to the third, given time limit, jump to the third issue, the specific security structure. We now have two competing versions, the proposals regarding security infrastructure building in Asia. When you talk about a regional level security architecture, it's always the U.S. and China. Right? We have a version of the security cooperation proposal from the U.S. That is the principled security network, right? Actually proposed by the Obama administration. We don't even know what's the plan or what's the strategy of the Trump administration insofar as Asian security cooperation is concerned. We will know something tomorrow. So when the U.S. Secretary of Defense, General the Mattis, delivers his speech tomorrow in the Shangri-La conference, that will be the first time that we will hear about a comprehensive description, comprehensive blueprint of the Trump administration toward Asia in terms of defense issues and security issues. So far, we know is that the U.S. has proposed the so-called principled security network, which has three features. The number one feature is the promotion of values, democratic value, and freedom of navigation, and a few other values. And number two is the co-sharing of the burden. So basically, even from the Obama administration, the U.S. started to ask its allies in the U.S. In Asia to share the costs. Right? So Japan and Korea might have to pay. And the third feature is the rule of law. Right? So the U.S. calls for a rule-based order. Right? And in 2016, China proposed something called the new security concept, which a little bit ambiguous, but we can see a few organizing principles. The number one principle, China calls for new security concept, which emphasizes on common interest, right? A common interest emphasizes on the less confrontation, but more cooperation. Identify common interest and let's work on the common interest. Right? So that's one feature. The second feature is partners, not alliance. Not alliance. If you compare that with the U.S. approach, the U.S. approach is to impose a law-based framework, so basically treaties, right, to band its allies together. So you have legal obligations, right? Have legal obligations. For example, Korea and Japan have legal obligations when war breaks in Asia. But the Chinese approach is let's do not resort to law, right? Let's work as partners, right? Not as parties to a contract. And the third characteristics of the Chinese approach is development. So we work together. You link security to economic development, right? Which is actually very novel because you don't do that in the American approach. The economic development is very much a byproduct of the American security infrastructure framework. But the Chinese approach is we link this together. So that's why you have the AIIB, have the One Belt, One Road. So link security and development together. Right. So that's very much the three features of the Chinese system. It's quite obvious that the Chinese approach does not emphasize very much on the rule of law, does not care too much about the rule of law. I would characterize the American approach as power plus rules, right? Power plus law, because power means you have the real power, right? Without power you can't do anything. And the Chinese approach is very much also power-based because China will use its economic power and increasingly its military power to encourage maybe some years later compel other countries to join its system. But it's power plus relational building, right? So based on my power, let's build good relations, not very much on the rule of law. So we will see which these are still two competing versions. The only time can tell us eventually which version will prevail. Maybe someday they will combine these two into one version. So I would stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wang, for very thought-provoking presentation. And actually, we have time constraint, so I'd like to ask other panelists to keep the time. And then now I'll give the floor to Professor Ru Jian from China.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So first, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the Professor Jeju and for his the kindness, just the invitation to invite me to attend this the greatest event. So the Jeju Forum. So in particular, we'll talk about these topics: the role of international law in East Asia. So just the Professor Wang gave the very good speech and to tell us why the role of international law is important in East Asia, so why we should have it. So to talk at this point, so the issues is very broad. So my thinking is only just a thinking. I cannot say it's a very just well-developed just theory. So starting because I teach in the EU law and also from inspired by them, how can just from the economic and then just spill over to the political and the rule of law, something like that. So and now we say now in the world, so now economic development is also one of the key issues in the international plane. So every countries and very much just focus on the development. And also internationally, even UN, United Nations also focus on the development and sustainable development. So I just thinking whether we can just say, okay, so the development or economic development or sustainable development is one of the vehicle for the East Asia to enhance the rule of law in this region. So I would like to say, okay, because the development, of course, now in China, we have to say, sometimes say, okay, everything can just depends on the development. So everything can be resolved, developed. So it is in the process of development. There you can solve everything. So, but I don't think it's not always true. But anyway, so this is if you have the focus on development, so probably it bring you something more. But when we say the development here, well, of course, including the economic development, social, now we have not only economic development, and also social development and cultural development, and even just political development. So, and why? Now, internationally, so when we say the development, not only just okay for economic prosperities, but also now we can focus on the social justice, international social justice. So we are just fight against just the poverty and climate change and the environment issues. So why? So this is the development that I try to describe. So here mainly focus on the economic development and then to the social associated with the sustainable development and the social justice, and also the political development. So why we say this could be economic development could be the vehicle? So here I would like to say first, of course, in the East Asia, in particular in the Northeast Asia, because we are influenced by the Confucius, something like that. So the culture has some common cultural traditions. That means so we need just to focus on the well-beings of the individuals, of the peoples. So no matter what type of government or just the state, you must to foster the development of the economic development and try to make a good life to the people, so that people have a good life. So one of the primary just the goals for the government, of course, is to pursue the economic development. Second, now it says now internationally. So now the development is also now the theme of our time, and now even the UN also just to set up the goals of development for the 2030. Now 2000. So if you look at this goal, so now it's very comprehensive, not only just for the social development, but also including the development of the individuals and also well-beings of the individuals. So, and all just the state in this East Asia also just endorsed the goals. So this is something we now have to do. So this is the goal for that. And also, we're also facing some of the just common challenges. So now, just as our chairman said, now the East Asia also, for example, now peace and security issues. And now also we have another challenges. Now the challenge is that now we are in a shortage of the resources, not a shortage in the resources. So this is, I think, the new phenomena for the development. So that means you cannot even every state you cannot self-develop by yourselves. So you have the locally or just in the individual state, you have the short of the resources. So that's why when you want to develop, just to force to have the good development in the economy, you need just cooperations with other states. So that's why globalization actually happens, not globalization. But even though now the globalization is also facing a lot of challenges. So this is and of course, there's another issue. That means imbalance of development, the development. So the levels of development in the different regions have the different varies in the regions. We still have the poverty, and we still have facing the challenge of the social justice, or just say, okay, social exclusions or social inclusions. So in particular, after 30 years globalizations, so some countries become more and more rich, and some countries become more and poor. So now, how to just try to balance these areas? But this is also one of the cause for the issues of the peace and securities, and also one of the issues for the environment issues. So this is the common challenges. So how to deal with that in the process of the development? So this is also need the corruptions. Just corporations. Now corporations. So this is important. And then how so then now it says what's the conditions for the development. So which you need to have some of the common conditions. First, as a peace, security. So you have the peace, security, and stability. Stability. Second, you have the need. I think there is a international cooperation in the economic development. So this is becoming more and more important. Third is self-reliance. So that means each state must rely first on yourselves, and second, you need to further cooperation. So this is now is also the important. So when you have the peace and securities, and when you have how do you conduct the international cooperation and maintain the good cooperations, and next this cooperation could be foreseeable and could be predictable and very effective. So all this, they think you need international law, the international law. So that's why we says, okay, so along with economic development, because you need to cooperate in order to pursue your developments. So you need to cooperate, maintain the peace and securities. So you are also required. You must to stick to the international corporations, and also you also just say first have the self-reliance by yourself. So in these situations, so international law could play the more and more important roles. First, I think respect for the sovereignty, the sovereignty of the states. So why? So each state could have just to take its own policy for the development. So this is actually was also endorsed, provided by the UN resolution in the 1986 on the right to development. So each state has right to development. Each state could adopt its own economic policy for its development. Okay, so this is important, not important. And the second, so you should have the state should be just during the cooperations and try to, no matter you have just to enter into the treaties, anyway, creating the just international law. So the international law means just. So this just, of course, first this international, the content, the purpose is to advance peace and security, the just. And the second is to respect and fulfill the human rights, not human rights. The third, I think, so now we need just also to the international law to enhance the international law, the predictability and the transparency and integrity of the international law. The fourth is mechanism. We need to set a mechanism for the effective cooperations. So this is now actually, so these rules in the international law is also developed, or is also in the process of development. And then, of course, we should also develop, establish the mechanism for the dispute resolution in this particular region. But of course, so because each state has their vital interests. Now, for the international law, you also need to try to, the state should be accountable, responsible, and cooperative, and also should be balanced sovereignty, vital interests, and observations of the international obligations. Now, if we have the international exists just in the place. So with that, so if the state puts the economic development as a priority, I think probably could be one of the vehicles to foster or to enhance the role of international law in this region. So this is my.
Thank you, Professor Lu, for your insightful presentation. And actually, we have now 35 minutes left, so quite lagged behind our schedule. So once again, I would like to ask other panelists to keep the time. And now I would like to invite Professor Banzai to make his presentation.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Singh, for introducing us to the distinguished participants. I would first of all like to express my sincere gratitude to you for inviting me to join you all as a member of the prestigious Jeju Forum, together with such prominent reporters and before an excellent audience. I consider it a great honor. I would like to discuss today's common theme from the perspective of what can be considered the most important of the various laws of international law in the situation in East Asia today. It is said that where there is a society, there is a law. When there is a legal order in a society, the rules shall guarantee to basic conditions, stability, and predictability. For example, when the EEZs and continental shelves are delimited according to the equitable principles of the UNCLOS, countries concerned can be satisfied with the results of their own negotiations done in equal status, even though those negotiations tend to be difficult. However, in East Asia, there are circumstances that would appear to be excluding the other's benefits, backed by differences in the power of nation-states. So, the more political and military tensions are growing, the more unstable the region is becoming. In East Asia, countries are seeking their own prosperity too much to keep peace, though peace is a foundation of prosperity. Since this region too is a part of the international order, it is vital not to tolerate practices and pressures intended to force the acceptance of unilateral claims based on the power of nation-states. In this sense, sovereign equality as a fundamental principle of international law will play an important role in prosperity and peace with legal stability and predictability in East Asia. Probably one other distinguishing feature is the situation in North Korea. North Korea's nuclear and missile development efforts are causing other countries in the vicinity to strengthen their own defense structures, while these defense-related developments are inspiring mutual distrust. It is true that North Korea has brought to the surface the unequal structure of the NPT. However, there is no room under the current international system for allowing the possession of nuclear weapons for purposes of survival of a country's own regime. Together with the responses of Security Council, it is essential to manage the situation to ensure that there will not cause any accidental incidents by North Korea through diplomatic efforts such as six-party talks. It goes without saying that the fundamental principles of non-use of force and peaceful settlement of disputes are of utmost importance in doing so. For the above-mentioned instabilities of this region, security in connection with the field of high politics in the form of the power balance among nations is attracting even more attention than before. International law is not a complete law to solve various problems of the distortions of international society. In that sense, it is a law of intermediary goals. While international law sets only intermediary goals, there may be people and countries that suffered by the distortions of society behind the legal stability and predictability if these two elements only contribute to the riches and the powers. So, especially an agreement of ease with North Korea, which shall be unacceptable because human rights of the suffered people by its leaders group cannot be sacrificed in the name of our prosperity. What the rule of law demands is consideration of appropriate actions through identifying the philosophies that have been built up historically through practices by various countries. It is only through such a response that the claims of various countries will become rational instead of emotional. I believe that there is a need for ensuring rational claims under international law so that East Asia can become a stable community in which order is preserved even in the face of differences of opinion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Banzai. And now the floor goes to Professor Hong.
Well, thank you for giving me this chance to be part of this very important discussion. My name is Songpo Hong, and I'm teaching international law and human rights. And I also used to serve as a chair rapporteur of United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. I'm very happy that to hear some of the comments which are not really different from my own views. I'm really happy to hear that peace matters, development matters, and human rights matters, and that those, as a group, those components actually serve as the pillars of the United Nations, and actually they should serve as a future pillars of this region. But my comments actually derive from my humble experience as a scholar, as a student in international law, and at the same time as part of civil society, and that has been striving to achieve some of the tangible goals. And I also believe that we should, in order to achieve very high level goals, we should get started from the scratches. We should get started from very down to earth things. And personally, I've been engaged in North Korean human rights movement, and actually 20 some years ago, I wrote a dissertation about Korean comfort women case in the United States. The idea was not about Japan bashing Japan, but it was more about what about individual remedies to the victims of historical injustices, not in the name of national laws, but under the name of international law. So I was trying to link the rules of public international laws, the state-oriented, state-centric international law rules, to the lives of the individuals. And the comfort women case was just one subject for that. So, well, let me just share some of the personal questions that I have had while watching this region for the last 20 years. Well, simple questions. Why do we still have North Korea as it is? Why do people still have to suffer that way and that much? When we still, when we really witness the rise of East Asia. I mean, this is an amazing region. I mean, look at the world. I mean, after the Second World War, still 80% of UN peacekeeping forces, they are in Africa, still there. And, mass-scale killings are still, we witness mass-scale killings, and we hear sad stories all the time. But in this region, we hear, well, economic leadership, development, and prosperity. But then why we still have North Korea as it is now? And say another example, like so when UK did wrong when it took Hong Kong from China in 1842, and after 150 years, UK actually returned Hong Kong to China, which is right and which is true. But was there a referendum? And what about the residents of Hong Kong, the people in Hong Kong? Did they have a chance to make their own decisions about their political future? So my question is, do individuals have freedoms, or are individuals allowed to make choices about their own political identities and about their economic identities and actually about their future? Another thing, why do we still suffer from the remnants of Second World War? I mean, we still talk about comfort women case, and China and Korea still asking for the deeper sense of remorse, deeper sense of apology, and legal and assumption of legal responsibility on the part of Japan. Then Japan somehow says there's a fatigue of apology here, and Japan is. I think it's true. Japan, it seems to be at a loss in a way, and about concerning how to respond to the request from neighboring countries. And then why don't we have any regional organization here? China is a big country and strong country, and it'll become more stronger, definitely. Korea is struggling to get better, and then it's struggling to get reunited. Japan has been absolute leader in economy and world trade. Then why don't we have any regional organization, security, or human rights, or economy? And basically, do we have any idea about region? Do we have any idea about East Asia as a region? We always say East Asia is composed of a group of states, very dominant, very unilateralistic, and very assertive at the same time. And basically, we have never actually had a chance or experience to have a dialogue among ourselves. And then, so we never, in a way, it's very strange that we never had a real chance to speak among ourselves without intervention of a third party, for example, the United States. Settlement of Second World War? Yes, there was United States. Security? Yes, there was United States. And China keeps talking about United States, the presence of U.S. Army here in this region, and not about Korea or not about Japan. And I'm not quite sure whether we have a sense that we can deal with our own problems among ourselves. So these are the ideas that I have. These are the questions that I have in mind while trying to touch on this issue of rule of international law in this region. Rule of law, as we all know, it's opposite to rule by man, and under rule by law, law is a mere tool for a government suppressing its own people in a legalistic fashion. So rule of law is about transparency. It's about process. It's about consensus, and it's against arbitrary use of powers by the states and against people. And on the international scale, the rule of law, well, UN says rule of law is about adherence to the principles of supremacy of law, equality before law, accountability to the law, fairness in the application of the law. And so, and separation of powers, participation in decision making, legal certainty, and avoidance of arbitrariness. And UN also, well, in one of those high-level meetings, UN also said just the three themes: human rights, peace and security, and development. So my humble suggestions actually are the followings. First, the point: we should get started on making dialogues among ourselves. So we have to get started anyway, and then we have to do this. And speaking of dialogue, I do not mean asserting our own positions. Well, it includes it. I mean, it includes assertion of Korean positions, stances, Japanese stances, Chinese stances, Singaporean stances. But it has to also include the commitment for the consensus for the future. So we talk about our own positions and we stress them, but at the same time, we should be very vigilant to the needs of others. And so second, where should we begin? Let's start from universal values. Let's start from the commitments and agreements that we have already made. And I think those include these steps. Just as peace and security, human rights, development, and non-aggression, non-proliferation of nuclear arms, non-intervention on internal affairs, environmental protection, and human rights. Good stuffs. Actually, we have made our commitments already, and we signed and acceded to many treaties. So why don't we get started from there? And second, we should get more concrete as time passes, and we should be more implementation oriented. So I hope we can have like a periodic review of our status of implementation. And we can also talk about some specific issues, say North Korea issue or some other. So I think we should, drill ourselves. We should train ourselves while taking care of and speaking about some specific issues that arise from the horizon. And then the last point I want to make is, we should have a set of rules, however vague or however flexible it may be. So I say we should have I propose that we want to have a kind of charter of the norms in a very flexible mode and with evolving nature of development. And the charter should be composed of some of the rules, some of the commitments that we have already made. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Huang, for very concrete and constructive suggestions on our topic. Let's have Professor Shim for the final comments on today's topic.
Yes, let me just focus on 2 points. One is partially a reflection of what Professor Hong already has said, which is why there is no institutional framework in East Asia or Northeast Asia. And the other is, where should we find a common thread that could have a possibility of developing into a regional institutional framework? The first one is that I try to just borrow some vocabulary from the game theory, because we don't get to agree to be bound by international law because we don't view the situation as a non-zero sum game, but a zero sum game. So by agreeing to be bound by certain rules of law, we tend to view ourselves as in the losing side when the other countries will get better positions in terms of the implementation or making pressuring other countries to pay more in certain situations. So we view these international situations as a zero-sum game. So that would make it very difficult for countries to reach a consensus or a common position on cooperation. Having said that, we also have to acknowledge that there is not much that we share in East Asian nation, in the region of East Asia as a commonalities. We have come from different regions, different places. We are different races. There are more differences than commonalities among the nations of East Asian groups of nations. So I'm just wondering why we are so focusing on having a overarching international institutional framework that would have more of that would be viewed more as an oppressive feature than a inclusive and participatory feature. So having that leads me to see where we should focus on in terms of just building a institutional framework, if that is ever possible in the East Asian region. And I see some promising case by looking at the international negotiations on climate change issues. Because a lot of countries have so many different differences in their national positions and in their national economies, and even in their emission potential. But they gathered together at the capital of France, Paris, to reach a consensus on the certain principles and the framework that they would act upon going forward. And that might be our starting point if we are intent on building an institutional framework in the East Asian region. That the underlying concept of the Paris Agreement is that every country is on their own to set their own targets, and everyone is encouraged to reach those targets in due time. And there is more encouragement involved than any kind of pressure to be involved in the implementation process. So that might be the institutional framework that we can emulate when we try to build up a institutional framework in the Northeastern region. And that might be viewed in the first beginning as a very weak institution, but it has a great chance of building into a more binding force over a long period of time. And I'll stop here, and then I'll welcome the other participants to comment on those.
Thank you, Professor Shim, for your very thoughtful comments. Actually, we have 15 minutes before the end of the session. So originally, I hoped that I can raise several issues or questions to the panelists, but given the time constraints, I'd like to open the floor to the audience, and then maybe I give the floor to the panelists to answer the questions raised. Before I open the floor, I raise several short questions to the panelists. There are many territorial and maritime disputes in our region, especially in South China Sea and East China Sea. So I want to know the view of Professor Liu on the role of international law in facilitating the resolution of these very thorny, typical disputes in our region. And then I would like to ask Professor Hong about how international law can contribute to the promotion of a corporate diplomacy in our region. I believe that the international law is really an important vehicle for making our region a place for cooperative diplomacy. So I want to hear his view. And then I would like to ask Professor Wang about the role of international law in facilitating the regional integration in East Asia, because as I mentioned in the introductory note, Southeast Asia is quite ahead of Northeast Asia in regional integration. So Singapore is one of the major players in promoting Southeast Asian regional cooperation. So I would like to hear his view. And then I open the floor to the audience. Yes, Professor Chung of Korean University.
Hello, my name is Suyong Chung.
Please use the microphone. Yeah.
My name is Suyong Chung. I'm a professor at Korean University based in Seoul, Korea. It's such a fascinating scene today that I have been looking at, because this is somewhat not the usual things that we can actually observe based in Korea. But I'm really glad to have this chance to discuss about role of international law in East Asia. I would like to provide some of my observations on some of the issues that distinguished speakers raised today. Looking at the international law in East Asia, what are we talking about? Are we talking about international law, or are we talking about European law? Because, the way in which international law has been developed actually started with Europe, and in many of the contents, the way of the development of law at the international level were pretty much based on European way of thinking. So there is a big difference in terms of how we develop the institutions between the Europe and Asia, in a sense that European reason is based on contract. They are very good at actually talking about things. And then putting that in the context of developing international law in Europe was that they are very good at the sovereign bargaining. But here in Asia, we are not good at that. So in that sense, depending on different issue areas, I think that different role making, role of the international needs to be considered. And then so I think the first speaker talked about the power-based rule of law. I think if we go to the similar area of the discipline such as international relations, they are talking about the building the institutions based on either power or interest or sometimes norms and others. And then here, we are talking about the norm-based one, but how would you be explained about power-based rule of law from that angle? Then it's I don't quite understand that rule of law based on power, meaning that then there is no rule of law then talking about China, then there is a typical term describing what this at the national level, authoritarian pragmatism, meaning that even if we try to apply the rule of law concept, but the way in which China is run, sometimes it called it as particular relationship or guanxi, or sometimes it's really rule of law, sometimes it's because of fragmented authoritarianism that one scholar described about. So, there are different things. My question, is it really good for us to actually talk about the role of international law in East Asia using the European way of thinking? Is it something that we can do all? or the other way made around. So going back to 20 years ago when I wrote my PhD dissertation, my dissertation was about environmental institute building in Northeast Asia. I compared Europe and Asia. There is no way for me to think about possibly making multilateral treaties. So I was proposing the soft institution based on the market. So I think this will promote the development, peace, and prosperity in Northeast Asia. I think this might be a good sense of the fitting, the sort of, cutting edge discussions, even in the public international law perspective, because we not only have to discuss about the sovereign state, but also we have to talk about non-state actors as well in the framework of international law. So maybe, depending on how we frame things in the context of law, maybe East Asia might open new window to talk about, to find out the new realm of international law. So I raised one question to Professor Wang, and then another one was my observation. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone to raise a question or comments from the floor? No? Yes.
First, thank you for insightful presentation from all the speakers. It has been quite encapsulating what all the different nations had to say about the current state of things. And I'm currently a student at Lewis and Clark Law School, but I am a Korean and studying environmental law. And while I have heard from several speakers today that there can't necessarily be some kind of contract-based international law agreement in East Asia, I really do hope that there will be some kind of basic principles to agree upon and move towards some kind of consensus among the East Asian country. Because despite the differences in the perspectives regarding history, I think there are actually a lot of values to be shared upon, and especially because the youths do not seem to have as much divide as the older generations as to what the future should be. So I think there is actually quite a lot of possibility. And I do hope that the speakers would continue the dialogues towards a consensus for us to work on later. Thank you.
Thank you for your encouragement. I agree with your view that we have to see the state of affairs in East Asia half full, not half empty. I firmly believe that there is a strong foundation for upon which East Asian countries proceed toward the rule of law in our region, even though the past history, especially the bitter experience of imperialistic encroachment upon East Asia put a very negative impression on international law. But since the end of the Second World War, and especially the end of the Cold War, we are being more and more exposed to the importance of international law, and especially I would like to underline that one matters for our region is that we have to provide some concrete, tangible outcome to the people that international law can play a role for promoting peace and stability as well as prosperity in our region. So, in a sense, the devils are always in the details. So, as Professor Hong mentioned, we have to delve ourselves into more concrete items and more concrete outcome, which can prove to be positive in East Asia as a whole. So we have two questions and 3 questions from myself. So I'll give to each panelist to make comment or answers. Let me start with Professor Wang. Okay, yeah.
Very quick. First, a very quick response to Professor Shen's question. What lesson can Southeast Asia offer in terms of regional integration? My suggestion is you can start with the China, Japan, Korea FTA. That's the quickest way to realize East Asia economic integration. And you actually have good reasons to do that because the 3 economies complement each other. Unlike Southeast Asia, right? The Singapore is most advanced. It's the only developed country in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is actually not a perfect place to have regional trade agreements. But China, Japan, and Korea can have a very good FTA. The response to Professor Chang's question, that's truly a wonderful, insightful, and provocative question. Actually, a few questions. The first, which international law? That's if we stick to the words of international law, there is only one system of international law, right? Which, as you correctly mentioned, started in Europe, and which has certain universal attributes, has certain universal values. The rule-based system, you have a dispute, you resort to the legalized dispute resolution, and you have binding rules, and those rules would generate rights and obligations. So if we are talking about international law, that's the only one you have. If you don't like that, if you want to find an Asian way of doing things, then we don't have to call it international law, right? We can call it something else. There could be 2 alternatives. One alternative was in the past. So the ancient Chinese system, the tributary system, right? You have a Middle Kingdom and surrounded by a few semi-independent states. And another alternative is the so-called ASEAN way of doing business, right? The ASEAN way is we achieve consensus for everything. Otherwise, we don't do anything, right? So China's approach is more inclined, is more toward the ASEAN way. So, for example, China's One Belt, One Road, the AIIB, and also the Chinese proposal with respect to security architecture is let's come together, let's talk, let's achieve consensus, right? Nobody can impose rules on others, right? The American approach is I have a system of rules ready, so you have to buy it. You have to subscribe to it. The Chinese way is let's come together, let's talk, let's develop rules together, let's do not confront each other. That's actually kind of more ASEAN way, but that's not what international law features, right? The current system of international law require that you have a clear set of rules. Right? So regarding the definition of the power in international law, we can talk offline. Thanks.
Thank you. Can I add one more question to what you told us? In that sense, can you consider the ASEAN way of doing business a context of creating soft law, not hard law?
Yeah. Guidance.
Guidance, guideline.
Best practice.
But if you accumulate the implementation of such soft law, then it can develop into hard law.
Hopefully.
Yeah, of course, it depends on how it will proceed. But usually in the field of environmental law as well as human rights law, the soft law preceded, and then it is being crystallized into norms of international law, binding norms of international law. So, in the sense, I appreciate the ASEAN way of doing business, especially given the still negative attitude toward the rule of law in East Asia as a whole. They prefer political way of resolving issues to the strict rule of law. In my view,
it's a bit inefficient, but it protects smaller countries.
Yes. Then I'll give the floor to Professor Lu. Yeah.
Thanks, Chairman, very much. So your question says territorial disputes just in China.
Territorial and maritime. Yeah.
yes. So is and what's the role of law just played just in the facilitating the solving this disputes? So first we should say the disputes. So the disputes arising from I think two things. One is different understandings of the law, the rule of law. Second, probably is different characterizations of the facts, not the facts. So when we talk about the territorial disputes, so unfortunately, international law in this field is quite ambiguous. So it is gray areas. So there is no treaty which is for how can you just acquire just a piece of land first. And then we talk about just the UNCLOS, so the United Nations, the Convention on the Law of Sea. So they says, okay, they are talking about just the areas of the sea, not about the sovereignty of the land. So when we talk about the land of the island or the rocks which belongs to, is also applied just the general international law concerning the acquirement, the obtaining of the territorial, the land, the territory, the acquire of the territory. So these areas, actually is only you have the set of the number of the cases. So and also says is customary law. So what's a customary law? What's clearly the rules? Actually, it's ambiguous. So this is disputes happens, so occurred. Second, I said China. Now I want to talk about China, how to solve it international. I think generally, if you look at China, just when we now say these disputes actually will be open, and then China try to seek the way to solve these disputes. So generally, I think the actions, the way the China take, generally in the line with the international law, not in line with the international law. First, I think to say, okay, so China actually, its claim, now you should look at what have the Chinese government's claim. So said claim the entitlement or the sovereignty over the piece of land or over the piece of the just island or the rocks, or even with the so-called in the South China Sea. So normally it's based upon the international law. So their claims is not just, okay, the claims it was made arbitrarily, disregard of the law, but it's based upon the law. But maybe, because as we said, people have different understandings of the law. So this is of disputes. Second, so of course we says China try to solve these problems with I think is also according to the international law. I just give the first example. Probably we says, okay, we are trying to solve this just try to the disputes, stick to by the way of the peaceful ways, means. So that's according to the United Nations charters, not peacefully just to settle disputes. Do not restrain, just to try to restrict himself, constrain himself from using the force and to attack, so to solve these problems. Second, concerning with just the disputes in the South China Sea, so China just have the negotiations with the disputing party states and is at ASEAN. So they are talking about trying to solve, also just try using the way of the legal ways, international ways. So they are trying to negotiate also the code of conduct. Now the code of conduct, try to use the legal ways, try to maintain the peaceful situations just in the South China Sea. So this is also one of the efforts they are trying to take to solve the disputes. And even if they now, so now you have, say, because of disputings, so you have in the enforcement, just the implementation of the laws. So defending the interests by the takes actions to even the actions they take to defend their interests is also try to look at what's the international law within the scope of international law. Do not go beyond it. And then, so probably I think we say, okay, you have disputes, but then finally we says, okay, probably just say, okay, how about the Chinese attitude to the ignore just the arbitration, so the arbitration cases, not arbitration cases. So yes, China, of course, just is a member of the Anglos, I'm a member of the Anglos. So we are also just to agree with this compulsory just arbitrations, but we also made the reservations. But this is also one of the different understandings is arising from here. First things. Second thing that so the different probably are different perspectives of on the organizations, the whole process and organizations of the arbitration panels, not the panels, and then to say that what will happen behind the scene. So probably we don't know. So this is now they do like just to ignore, disregard it, and do not accept it, the arbitration awards. And this is not what the China do just solely, but it also happened just in the history in the past. And then, so for the adjudication. So why I say probably not say why do you just go to for the International Court of Justice or some of the international tribunals to settle disputes. So international law is different from the domestic law. It's the first to adjudication go to the court. It's the last resort to solve disputes. Probably China and also disputing states maybe regard this and still not go to the last resort. They still have the more place or just alternatives, just try to solve disputes. Second, in international law, adjudication is not compulsory. It is optional. So it's based on voluntary of the states. So China, actually, they insisted they can try to solve disputes by the negotiations. And this is what they are insisted, and this is also what they are practiced now in the try to solve disputes. So China generally, so international law gave the guidelines for China to settle these disputes. But the problem is, of course, so now it depends on if China stick to the negotiations to settle disputes, and other parties still just agree with that to negotiate. It depends on their negotiations. So what's the consensus they can build up and what agreement they can reach so for the disputes. So I think generally, so international law facilitate to settle this kind of disputes and to help China to understand that.
Thank you, Professor Lu, for your very succinct answers to my question. But it seems to me that still our region is far behind in terms of making recourse to international adjudication regarding maritime and territorial disputes. So in that sense, maybe we have to work very hard to nurture the culture of this region more forthcoming toward the frequent use of international adjudication like Southeast Asian countries. They have already reported many territorial disputes to International Court of Justice or arbitration. So countries in Northeast Asia should learn a lesson from our Southeast Asian colleagues. That's what I want to underline in this aspect. Now I'll give the floor to Professor Hong. Yeah, Professor Hong, and then Professor Banzai later. And, yeah.
Well, the question is about how we can promote the cooperative diplomacy in this region. I think the promotion of rule of law in the region is one thing, and the idea of regional integration is another. But in a way, we are trying to link those two issues and put those two things in the same box, because we want rule of law to be proliferated in this region, and because we want to see more integration in this region as well. Let me just draw some of the lessons from EU. First, we need more common experience. EU had to go through 2 world wars to have a better idea about themselves. They fought a war against authoritarianism, Nazis, and they also fought a war against communism, against Russia, against Soviet Union. And then from those experiences, they could forge a better sense of regional idea about their political identity. And second, the very close and subtle link between political leadership and promotion of rule of law. So there were so many political leaders in Europe who were very much committed to the proliferation of rule of law and at the same time to the integration of the region. And third, the necessity. They need to develop and establish something called EEC, and call and still economic community. So we need to be more vigilant about need to get united. So what does Korea need from China? What does China need from Korea? I mean, and we should be able to develop and forge more components that maybe they can be used as fertilizer for those. And third, the culture of free exchanging free ideas. I mean, among intellectuals, among youth people, and among media. I mean, at every level, we should be able to nurture the culture of exchanging the ideas. And finally, well, I don't know, the common aspirations. First, I think it was quite well addressed by our colleague here. Economic prosperity, and that's one factor of our common aspiration in this region. And second, peace and security. And third, maybe engagement in international affairs as a group. So those 3 components, factors may play as a fertilizer to promote the regional integration and also at the same time cooperative diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hong. And the reason why I raised this question is that when we just pursue regional integration in East Asia, we cannot but rely on a kind of functional approach, given the political constraints that beset our region. So, for instance, Korea and Japan and China are confronted with transboundary air pollution problem. So if our 3 countries can work out a framework to address these regional pollution issue, then it can show or demonstrate the merit of the role of international law to the public in these 3 countries. So in the sense, we have to be more reliant on international law in promoting our regional integration than any other region in that regard. Now, I'd like to raise the final question to Professor Banzai. Many things are important for increasing or enhancing the role of international law in our region, but the most important factor is to promote the awareness of the public in each country toward the importance of the role of international law in ensuring peace and stability as well as prosperity in our region. In that sense, both Korea and Japan are very much suffering from the lack or dwindling interest or attention of the public about international law, as the poor attendance of the session demonstrated. So I'd like to ask Professor Banzai about how the Japanese government or the Japanese society are trying to just enhance the public awareness of the importance of international law in Japan.
Thank you, Ambassador Singh. Your question is very similar to the statement by the late Professor Brierly of the Oxford. Yeah, so the power of the implementation and the obedience of the international law is mainly dependent on the understanding of the international law by the public. Ambassador Sin's question is very closely related to the question from the floor, and the first one is just going out. But yeah, so Japanese government and the Japanese people is now awareing the importance of international law in abstract way. Yeah, so Japanese government always placed emphasis on the rule of law in East Asia or in South China Sea, but it's not so concrete. This is the reason why the questioner indicated that this is related to the concerns about the differences of the cultures between Europe and Asia. So international law has a background of Europe. So in interpreting a rule of international law, the way of thinking and the procedure to implement and acquire and reach to the consensus may be European. But this is not the issues to be answered negatively, because it includes the sovereign equality and equality before the law. But on the other hand, on the sovereign equality, treaties can be concluded, and in this process, we can include our own cultures based on, for example, Confucius, Professor Lu just mentioned. Yeah, so we have to have close dialogue to be able to adapt our cultures to European way of thinking. This is the Japanese government's issues, or the other Asian countries' issues, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Banzai. And it's time to wrap up the session. And I'd like to conclude this session by mentioning my view on the state of affairs of international law in our region. If I rely on so-called SWOT analysis, strengths, weakness, opportunity, and threat, we have strong economic vitality to boost regional integration, which will help promote the role of international law in our region. Weakness, lack of trust is still strong impediment to promoting international law in our region. In terms of opportunity, I think the growing interdependence among the countries in the region will be a boon to the promotion of international law. And lastly, threat factor might be the return of geopolitical power game in our region, which will doom the future of the role of international law in our region. So all in all, I think we can appraise the status of international law in our region harmful, as I mentioned. So we have to work very hard to reach out to the people and civil society to play a more active role of promoting international law in East Asia, which is very, very essential for ensuring peace and prosperity in this region. Having said that, I'd like to end this session, and I would like to express my deep gratitude to the panelists and as well as audience who just attentively participated this session. And my final thanks go to the interpreters who make this session a very meaningful event. Thank you very much.